Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine McSharry, and as Deputy Director of the National Library of Ireland, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you this evening to our panel discussion, Queering the Pitch, Notes on Activism and Archival Practice. This panel discussion is the latest in the National Library's series of events and online tours that coincide with our exhibition, Living with Pride, Photographs by Christopher Robson. That exhibition is running at our National Photographic Archive in Temple Bar. And if you haven't had a chance to visit, I would urge you to do so. It's a real treat. The events programme associated with the exhibition was co-curated for the National Library by Tonie Walsh. And the whole programme has been hugely enjoyable, inspiring, and stimulating. I'm certain that this evening will also be all of those things. This panel brings together speakers who have worked to collect and to conserve Irish LGBTI+ histories. Their work has preserved documentation and ephemera relating to Irish activism and LGBTI+ communities across the island of Ireland. For that reason, it's a really particular pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, who will in turn introduce you to our panellists. My colleague Elizabeth Kirwan has worked as a librarian at the National Library of Ireland since 1984, and she currently manages the National Library's National Photographic Archive and our Conservation Department. Elizabeth was one of the initial members of the National Library's Diversity and Inclusion Committee and currently serves on the committee as the LGBT+ champion. Elizabeth has also been an active member of the Irish Queer Eye Archive, the IQA working group, since 1999. In 2008, the National Lesbian and Gay Federation, supported by LGBT+ communities throughout Ireland, transferred the IQA to the National Library. It was the first time that the Irish state officially recognised LGBT+ documentary history. And so, with that rich tradition, I am delighted to hand you over to Elizabeth to get our evening started.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Welcome to our wonderful panel, and welcome to all of you from Ireland, from overseas, particularly our transatlantic and our friends and our supporters in Japan and the Middle East, and right back across Europe. And Tonie in Turkey, if you're listening in, hi to you, and thank you for organising the events outreach programme. It's a real privilege for me to have our three panellists here this evening, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Just to explain, before I do that, what the format for this evening is. So, after I've introduced our panelists, we're going to begin in conversation with. So the format is a chat. It's easy, it's informal. And if you want to be involved in this chat, please put your comments in the chat function and we'll pick those up as we go along. So let's go and explore archives in the LGBT+ fashion. And I want to start by introducing Sara Phillips. Sara, hi Sara. Sara is a trans archivist and she works globally. She's been involved with trans activism for over 25 years. She's currently in her 9th year as chair of the board of directors of Ireland's national trans organisation, Transgender Equality Network Ireland, TENI or TENI as it's known as. Sara is the founder, researcher and archivist of the Irish Trans Archive, and she was one of the lead negotiators to the Gender Recognition Act 2015 and served on the governmental review of the Act in 2018. Sara was honoured as Dublin's LGBT plus Pride Grand Marshal in 2018. Sara is also a board member of the National Women's Council of Ireland and treasurer of both the International Trans Fund in Berlin.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation from the National Library, and good evening to Sara and Orla. And I'll read out what I sent to the library. It says, Richard O'Leary grew up in Cork and began his activism in 1988 as a student with the Gay Soc at Queen's University Belfast. In 2006, Richard and his late partner, Reverend Kingston, took a landmark successful discrimination case against the Irish government's Department of Social Welfare to recognise them as a couple. Richard obtained a DPhil in sociology at Nuffield College, University of Oxford, before working for some years as a lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast, where after some years he gave up statistical modelling and swapped it for LGBT history and performance storytelling. So I was coordinator of the LGBT Heritage Project in Northern Ireland until May of this year, when I left it to focus on archive-based live performance storytelling. And my next solo show is due to open at the Mac Theatre in Belfast this November, based on my personal and other archives, with a provisional title of My Queer History of Northern Ireland.
Hi, everybody, and that sounds fabulous, Richard. I'm really excited to see it. Yeah, it's weird in yourself, and I realised I sent a really long kind of like bio, but I suppose the key thing is that the founder of the Cork LGBT Archive and the author of Queer Republic of Cork, which traces the history of the Cork LGBT community from the 70s to the 90s, and also the short play Leaside Leslie's. So I've kind of been around a while, active in the Cork scene since the 1980s. And I suppose, I'll talk more about kind of why I set up the archive in a while, but there's a digital archive, physical archive, and the digital archive is also on the Digital Republic of Ireland and on Europeana. This year and in the last few years, we've gotten a lot of kind of recognition and awards for the archive. So we were shortlisted as one of 6 heritage finalists for the National Lottery Good Causes Award, which was amazing. And also UCC gave me the Athena Swan Equality Award this year. So that was amazing. So I think that's enough about me. So thank you. Okay, so we seem to have lost Elizabeth temporarily, so we're kind of leading the discussion ourselves, and no bother to us. So I'm delighted to be here with Sara and Richard, because all of us have worked really together over the last few years, and I'm indebted to both of you for your activism and your archival activism. And I mean, I started to call myself a queer archival activist over the last few years, and I would call both of you that as well. And I think for me, one of the things about the work that the three of us do is the fact that it's about creating the opportunity for a fuller and more nuanced and more inclusive version of Irish history, and in particular of Irish LGBT history. And I know, lots of people have heard me talk a lot about my frustration with the fact that too often our versions of history tend to be capital centric, and that national equals happens in Dublin. And I think a lot of the work that all of us have done has been to try and expand that, both in terms of like geographically, but also in terms of making sure that the L, G, B, and T are included. And I think that that's really been something that's been very important to me, and to recognise that the history that happens in Cork or in Belfast or wherever it happens, that's also part of our national history, and that national history isn't just what happens in Dublin. So I'll kick it over to the other two.
I may be back now, am I? Yes.
You are.
Thank you. Thank you. Orla, thank you. That was a super question to kick off with. And can I note that Cork seems to be a great bed for generating LGBT plus activism. Sara, I'm going to ask you, can you respond to what Orla said there? And I'm sure Richard and Orla won't hold it against you for not living in Cork.
She spent enough time here to be an honorary Corkonian.
I didn't want to mention that earlier, to be honest with you, because I allowed the fact that Richard is currently in Northern Ireland, that maybe that kind of made that slight difference. But I think Orla makes a really great point, because I think it kind of mirrors to a certain degree where I have come from within my own research and archive and collecting. You know, my own research and archiving, what I have really comes from my own collection. It comes from my own history. It comes from that point of me looking for my tribe. So it's taking newspaper cuttings before I'm out, taking magazine cuttings, all of these things that are going on, I suppose, in Ireland where I was not happy to be out at the time. So therefore I was collecting my own stuff, my own evidence that we existed. But also the fact then that, more to the point, that when it came to kind of into the 2013, 2014, when I started considering looking at an archive, it was that accidental archive. I can't remember who mentioned, I think it was Tonie used that word before. It was more about the fact that, I realized we were at that point in the trans community in a moment of history that was happening and nobody was archiving it. And I was central to that. And I had a lot of information. I had a lot of backstory because I'd been part of the community for so long. And I think what was critical for me was that somebody was taking that on and somebody was reflecting, because my own experience of the Irish Queer Archive is very little trans stuff is in that archive. There are bits and pieces of odd bits within the GCN section, but for the best part, there's very little. But yet there's a rich history of trans community gathering and being active in various different ways over the last 40, 50 years. And the fact that we existed prior to that. So it was key for me that, one, that we were able to gather what we were doing historically within the period of time of all that activism of, 2011 to 2015. And then secondly, then to reflect what had actually been happening prior to that there was a history. Because I've heard other people talk, nothing happened before 2003. Well, actually, there was a lot of things happened. The problem was it was happening by individuals, or it was happening by, one or two people together. And none of these individuals were connected and they weren't there working together. So it was important for me to be able to get that and put it together and show this rich history that the trans community have, specifically, in Ireland, and also moving back, reflecting into the diaspora and the fact that we moved out there into the world. And like the fact that I can tell you that I can number more trans or gender variant Irish people in the 19th century than any other country is a massive piece of information to wonder why, and that is a truth. That is not something I'm just picking off, kind of off the top of my head. This is something that is clear. Those names are out there and there's more and more names popping up every day. So that was what it was for me. It was mirroring that, getting that archive, and adding it to the T to the LGBT as well.
And Richard, for you, what was the driver to you around your archive?
Yes, thank you. Because I know that none of the three of us on the panel are professional archivists. We're all activists who accumulated material. And I think one of the reasons that we personally collected material was, if you think back a few decades, and I'm now in my mid 50s, there was official denial about the existence of trans, gay men were criminalized until 1993, and there was a deliberate ignoring that lesbians existed. So I think in that context, in our own lives, personal items became important, romantic cards that we exchanged among ourselves, or magazines that we had to make some effort to buy. We held on to those objects, partly because they were important to us, and also you couldn't give them away to a charity shop, for example, because the material was contentious. And I'd like just to point out that in those times, just being visible was itself a form of activism. So people shouldn't think, I don't have any activist material because I wasn't an activist. Just being visible, in being partially out, was activist. And that should also affect, I think, the way that museums and libraries collect material. Because I'll give you an example from my own, because I have material here in the house. Here's a postcard that I sent to my mother in 1989. And it just says, "Dear Mom, I'm getting on fine, on holidays, love, Richard." So that doesn't look like a queer archival item. But on the same day, June 8th, 1989, I sent another card to my friend Sara in Dublin. And in that card, I said, "Dear Sara, we are enjoying ourselves together. Love, Mervyn and Richard." Which tells you that the card I sent to my mother, I denied that I was gay. This was a time when we were criminalized. The card I sent to my friend, I talk about my partner. It's only when you put these two cards together that you have a meaningful queer archival item. And I think if we realize that we have to take that approach to the materials that we have ourselves, and for the museums and libraries to recognize that they themselves have to piece together our hidden history, which was made invisible by deliberate policy of the state and the homophobia and transphobia in our societies. That's, I think, what makes much of our history different to the mainstream history and archival work.
And can I ask the three of you, this challenge that your archives have presented to heteronormative archives, when you went to try to get funding or to try to promote your collections, did you find that you were up against a heteronormative brick wall, effectively?
Well, I think I'm in a slightly different position to what Richard and Sara were talking about, in the sense that it's not just a collection that I gathered myself. I've been really fortunate to have been able to start the Cork LGBT Archive with the Arthur Leahy collection at its core. So while I collected some bits myself, I'm really indebted to the fact that Arthur had that foresight to start gathering that material. I think that, what Sara was saying there about, the importance of that evidence that we existed, I think that is really, really crucial. And there's that narrative so often that all the kind of changes that happened in the last while, that they just kind of happened out of nowhere. And for me, and I think for Richard and Sara as well, it's about showing the fact that those changes built on the decades of activism that happened before, whether that was the activism Richard is talking about visibility, or whether it is more kind of organized, campaigns. But it was decades of people being brave and being active that led to the kind of changes that happened. But Elizabeth, sorry, to answer your question after my little detour, again, I think the benefit
before you do that, isn't it about you can't be what you can't see? And if you don't have documentary evidence of your past, effectively, it was considered that you didn't actually exist.
No,
or you
absolutely.
Didn't have an existence.
Exactly. And I think that's true for mainstream society. It's also true for some LGBT histories and some LGBT collections, because one of the frustrations that led to me being motivated to do the work that I'm doing is seeing kind of Irish LGBT histories that were basically completely Dublin-centric and focused on the activities, of the personal activities often, of a couple of gay men. And if it wasn't something they were directly involved in themselves, and if it didn't happen in Dublin, it didn't happen. So it's not just for the wider society to know we existed, but it's also for the Irish LGBT community to know existed. And you mentioned earlier about the range of activism that happened in Cork. I mean, Cork was a hotbed of activism, especially in the 1980s. But that's seen as kind of local history, and it's dismissed as being local history. And then when we talk Irish history, it's Dublin. And I think, Richard, one of the talks that you organised last year, I can't remember the person's name, but somebody was talking about research they had done, actually using the Irish Queer Archive on Belfast links with the Republic. And it was all focused on Dublin, even though we know that there was a lot of connections between Cork and Belfast, for example. There were cooperation law exchanges, they won prizes. But that wasn't included in the study that she did because she used the material just in the Queer Archive. And that's mostly Dublin focused. And the difficulty with that then is that we're not telling inclusive histories. And researchers are limited by the information that they can access. And I think that's, for me, was so important. I knew that this rich history was there. I lived this rich history. I'm still living this rich history. And so it was so important for me to have that be included and for people who were interested to be able to access that material. But similarly, I was really aware of the absences within the material that I had. Because again, it was the stuff that Arthur had been involved in or aware of. And, Sara was saying recently, it's like we've known each other a long time, but like a number of years ago, we didn't know one another. And the poor woman was trying to have a quiet dinner in Cork when she was accosted by this crazy archival activist to suck her brains for trans history. Because again, I knew it was there, but I didn't have the material. And Sarah's been so generous in sharing material from the Irish Trans Archive with the Cork LGBT Archive. And that's enriched what stories we can tell then. But I think you have to have the desire and the motivation to go seek what's missing. And I'm really aware of...
Fiona, can I ask Sara on that topic, Sara, have you found, since your archive has become better known, it's gotten more airing, have you found that people have come up to you and say, I have this shoebox under the bed. Would you mind it? Would you keep it forever? Would you make it available for somebody who wants to know about their trans history?
Well, first of all, I think I wish people did. There's been very little of that. I was listening to Orla there mention about Arthur Leahy's collection. I'm very friendly with Dr. Lydia Foy, who's like the doyenne of the trans community, and without her, we wouldn't be where we are today, and who has agreed to give me her collection. Now, this is a room. This is a full room in our house, so it's going to take some time to actually sort through it and go through it, etc. But generally, a lot of what I've got, and again, similarly, Tenny have provided me with their professional archive. So when it was more of an activist voluntary organization prior to 2010, which I've already done and collated. But a lot of the rest of it is speaking to individuals and trying to gather what they have, and I'm very conscious that, like what Orla said about, giving kind of that trans history, especially to Cork. One of the other things that happens with LGBT history sometimes as well is that only one side of the story is ever told, as you said, Orla. And like for a lot of people, and this is the organization that I'm currently the chair of within Tenny, for instance, would always have recognized that Tenny was started in Dublin in 2006. It wasn't. It never was. It was started in Cork in 2003. It fell apart a bit and was restarted again. And there's a better a longer conversation there as to why and what happened. But we have to recognize that it didn't start, and it didn't suit certain conversations to say that it started in Cork. And we have to reflect those conversations. We have to reflect what was going on, that people were not talking to each other, for instance, in the trans community, deliberately sometimes, because they were trying to live in stealth and do their own little bit of activism back in the 90s, for instance. But also what was key, and this is just to answer your question, and this is something that I think reflects back on something Orla said again earlier, was that actually a lot of this history is in individual stories. Sometimes it's not in the shoebox underneath the bed. It's not in the ephemera or the writings, etc. It's in their own, as Richard said, experience of being out and active. And I know a story. I'll share a quick story with you of many people within the trans community, LGBT community may know of Claire Farrell, former vice chair of TENI, long-term activist, founding member of the Friends of Egan back in the 80s. There was a lovely story I was told last year where a young person who had met Claire in 1980, very young at the time, eventually went on to transition in the late 80s. And it actually is key in a lot of activism that goes on in the 90s. And a lot of it is down to that initial meeting, that initial, support and advice that Claire had provided her before transition. So sometimes these stories, that story is not written anywhere. It's not on documentation. It's not on paper. It's purely by accident of knowing where this person comes from, how this activism works, and why she was so, passionate about doing something was because of this history of connecting with somebody over 10, 12 years earlier. And I think they're the sort of stuff that we need to try and, I suppose, document, reflect, and go out and get these oral histories, similar to what Edmund Lynch has done with, a different country. Because I think if we don't document them now, they'll eventually get lost. And I think, so for me at the moment, what I'm trying to do is reach out to the community, reach out to the LGBT community, and more specifically the trans community, to make those connections with people, to get those stories, or if somebody has a shoebox or an attic full of stuff that they're willing to let me add to the archive and mind and document for them, then I'd be delighted.
Could I ask you?
I think we've lost Elizabeth here, have we? Oh, we're back.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll tell you a bit about the situation in Northern Ireland while we're waiting for Elizabeth to come back. So in Northern Ireland, the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland has a very good collection of the papers of the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association and of the Cara Friend telephone and helpline service. And Tonie have been very good in recent years in publicising the existence of that material. The Linen Hall Library has a good collection of early newsletters and magazines, including some from the South. And I've actually been accessing that material myself, and I'll be holding an event on the 10th of September as part of European Heritage Open Week, telling stories from that archive. And thirdly, the Ulster Museum has a good photographic collection based on the Doug Sobey photos from the 1970s. So we have those materials in those institutions. Then 2 years ago, the Heritage Lottery Fund in Northern Ireland, for the first time, awarded money to what is the LGBT Heritage Project, which I managed until recently, and that's a project which continues. And that project, we recruited volunteers and began to gather oral histories, which is a very important area of work. I should just point out that in terms of the response of the sector, I think things are beginning to happen, but there's an underestimation that this type of archival work is quite resource intensive. So, for example, the Heritage Project I worked on, I was appointed part-time. and that wasn't adequate for the amount of work that has to be done that we're only starting out on. So it can't be done as cheaply as I think some of the authorities think it can be done by small grants. And secondly, this is quite challenging work. Sometimes people think, archival work, it might be a bit dry and maybe not too emotional. But for example, people who have personal items, they have an emotional attachment. They may not be comfortable in handing them to an institution. Secondly, so much material isn't written down. So I think there'll have to be a greater recognition that oral histories are particularly important. And they also, are labour intensive and expensive to collect if you want to do it professionally. And also there's additional sensitivities around. I mean, for example, gay men being criminalised until 93 in the south and 82 in the north. And the age of consent, was not equal. It wasn't lowered until quite late. That's an additional sensitivity around the materials that LGBT people hold. And these issues, I think, need to be acknowledged and discussed. And professional archivists and historians will, have to engage with those issues, which are not the same issues that apply in other areas of history and archival work in Ireland.
And that goes right back to this challenge to heteronormative practices and ways of collecting, and as both, as you've all said, actually, ways of describing content. Richard, I was going to, sorry about this unstable internet connection here at home, but what I wanted to ask was, Sara started talking about alternative voices, of alternative ways of describing an archive and sharing an archive. And you've been doing a lot of performative work, and you referred to it briefly there. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the new narratives that you're creating from existing archives and what that's doing to evoke a whole new set of archival material?
Thank you. I think one of the reasons why I adopted the method, I suppose, of performance storytelling was that if you try and research and share some of this material within conventional academia, historical journals, the requirements they have for evidence and for reference sources are quite high. And sometimes our histories are based on stories being told, but we haven't been given permission to share publicly, or they're based on anonymity and sometimes anecdote. So, conventional academic publications have their shortcomings in some of this work. And secondly, in terms, and I know this, having published again in sociology, the readership of this material is very small. Increasingly, the journals are behind paywalls that only academics and students in universities can access. And that's not what I think our history is about, that we want to share it with the public. And therefore, performance storytelling, and I do quite a bit on kind of podcast on Zoom. Pretty in Northern Ireland, we have a storytelling phenomenon called 10x9, TENX9.com, where most people are not LGBT, but a disproportionate number of LGBT people have actually told their stories in front of a live audience. They've been recorded. They go on podcast, or more recently on Zoom. I've told many stories there myself. And that's a way of reaching a wide audience. And in that case, that would be disproportionately, a non-LGBT audience, to be just an audience who want to hear real life stories. So I have found personally that way of sharing our history personally satisfying. but also a way of reaching a wider and different audience than going down an academic route, or even within the museum and library sector. I mean, though I know that there's been great work done by Judith Finlay and the National Museum and Kate Drinnan and the National Gallery, who are bringing our LGBT history to life because they're having more performative or more imaginative formats for presenting our LGBT history and heritage within our institutions. And the Outing the Past Festival, which is now an annual festival, taking place in Belfast, Dublin, Cork, Derry, that's also an interesting way of presenting our history to a wider audience.
Yeah, I just really agree with everything you're saying there, Richard, around the need to kind of make our history more accessible and to bring it to life and to, not have it be so kind of like boxed off. And that's something that's really motivated me with the Cork LGBT Archive as well. And I've tried to create multiple ways that people can engage with the history. Some people will want to come in and poke through boxes, but not everybody will want to do that. So the digital archive is fully accessible for people, and again, putting it on the DRI and Europeana was putting it out there more. But I've also tried to create more kind of like popular, engaging kind of ways, So there's Lisa Iglesias' play, which was performed by Link Drama, which traces the history of the Cork LGBT community, but also kind of through exhibitions. So, I've created a number of exhibitions where people can come in and see the history in a very visual way, lots of items from the archive in it, so that it's not wading through tons of words, that it's actually a way for people to see the history. And we just created a new exhibition that Richard is part of called Cork Queeros, which was kind of a photography exhibition highlighting a range of people within the community. And then we've done things like the walking tours, and when COVID hit, had to kind of reimagine that and create it as an interactive walking tour with plaques around the city on places of interest to the development of the community with QR codes that link to the archive. And then, using lots of different ways that people can engage with the history. So I think that is just so important. So I really think, and I think as well, Sarah's exhibitions that you've done, it's a very similar thing of being able to have people to see a very visual and accessible representation of our history.
Do you want to come in, Sarah, on that?
Yeah, because to me, and I've said this a number of times in any of kind of talks when I'm talking about the archive, to me, I don't want the archive to be in a load of boxes. I want it to live. I want these stories to live. I want people to understand it. And the great joy to a certain degree that I get, and while I don't use the same words as Richard does, I've had the great opportunities to go out and talk to students a lot of the time in the various universities around the place. And I try to do it more in a way of storytelling, albeit that I'm telling a 200-year history. Half the time I don't get to the end a lot of the time because I get wrapped up in these wonderful stories of individuals or campaigns or, kind of various different fun parts to what has happened in our lives as a community. And therefore, exhibitions to me has got to be key to that, because that's exactly how I launched the archive originally back in 2016 with an exhibition. And we tried to put in, as much as possible around the Road to Recognition, which is the Gender Recognition Act, around the pioneers around our community, similar to kind of Orla's Queerio sort of idea, but looking back of people who existed in the past. And then similarly, then the formation of the community as we know it from 2005, 2000 maybe, and onwards up over the last number of years, and how it starts to grow. But I do think it is critical not to just archive it, box it, collate it, and have it there and allow researchers to get at it. It's key that we start to spread it and it gets out there. The stories are told, that this understanding, because this is what's key for me is within the Irish Trans Archive, is this understanding that trans people have been here forever. because that is not something that the general public know. We seem to have appeared in the last 10 years or so, out of the ether. And for me, the archive therefore provides that background information, proof, the stories, the lives of individuals, all of that rich history. And that has to be got out there. It has to be told. It can't be just for researchers and academics. It has to be for the general public.
Could I ask you all to comment on or reflect or share we've around the area of allies and the importance of friends in either securing, funding, or promoting our individual archives? Richard, do you want to start off with that? So
I can actually, and I'd like to tie it in. Yeah, I'd like to tie it in with one of the kind of gaps in awareness around our LGBT history in Northern Ireland. There's a very significant feminist publication from the late 80s and 1990s called Women's News. And there's a collection of that at the Lindenhall Library. And when I was managing the Heritage Project, I sent some of my volunteers to look at that material and to produce a video presentation to draw attention that within women's news, there's a lot of lesbian history because lesbians and bi women were disproportionately involved. So people wouldn't think of women's news as, a lesbian publication, but actually, if you go there, there's a lot of lesbian history. And the Lindenhall Library have digitized quite a lot of it. The second thing about allies is in the last few years, institutions, in our case, like the Lindenhall Library and the Ulster Museum, they're being open to working with people like Orla and Sara and myself has definitely helped in terms of collating material and presenting material, and that gives me a great encouragement for the future.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you talk about. So yeah, I was saying it's interesting. Richard was talking about women's news because that was one of the exchanges from the Belfast women and the Cork women. Was a Cooperation North exchange where the Belfast women who were producing women's news came to Cork and trained the women in the Women's Place in the Key Co-op in Cork in the 1980s on producing a newsletter, which then led to the series of women's-based newsletters which are on our archive. And then the Cork women trained the Belfast women in creating a women's library. So, we're talking about that like really vibrant north-south links that were there. But Elizabeth, to go back to your question about allies, you mentioned allies helping us to get funding. I think that's one of the crucial things is we don't have funding. And, that the work that we do, they're passion projects and they're reliant on the passion and the commitment that you can hear from the three of us, tonight. But it shouldn't be like that. Now, I think there's a slight difference, in terms of there is some funding available in the North. As Richard was saying, it wasn't enough for it to kind of the work that's needed. But there isn't a source of funding to fund these community archives in the Republic. And there, I get very jealous of colleagues in the US and the UK who can kind of access proper funding. So over the years, we've developed a really positive relationship with the Heritage Council, and we've received a number of grants from the Heritage Council, but they're always very specific and short-term funding, to buy boxes or to produce banners or to buy a scanner. It's not core funding to enable us to have the staff that are needed to continue this work. So most of the work with the Cork LGBT Archive has been done on a voluntary basis, primarily by me for years. This summer, we've had another grant from the Heritage Council, which actually enabled us to have 2 people working with the archive over the summer, but again, on a part-time basis and for 4 months only. And in some ways, that was just absolutely amazing. And in another way, it's really frustrating because it showed so clearly what could be done when it wasn't just me doing this work on my own. And Patrick and Mira, who've been working with us, have really, really brought so much to the work and expanded the work that was being done. And it's been amazing. But I find myself, as the project is coming to a close, being really sad, because it goes back then to just being me trying to do this on a voluntary basis, knowing what is possible if there was proper funding there. So I think that that is one of the biggest gaps, is having proper source of funding for core funding. And we also have no premises. You know, we've nowhere to, I usually work, as I know, at my kitchen table. We've had, you know, some space from the Gay Project to work over the past few months, but that doesn't seem like it'll continue on a long-term basis due to changes that they're making. You know, so it's really precarious, and we're trying to do this work, and I think we're all doing incredible work, but without those resources. So the allies that we need are somebody to actually fund this work in a ongoing and comprehensive way. You know, I keep fantasizing about a rich queer version of Chuck Feeney that's going to come in and actually really give some money to Irish queer heritage projects, you know, because we really need it, you know. So yeah, that's my rant. But just in terms of, so I think the relationship with the Heritage Council has been really important for me. And when I got the first bit of funding from them to buy grey boxes, I was so excited, because to me, that was about them being inclusive. It was the symbolism of saying the work that we all do in gathering Irish LGBT history and heritage, that's important, and it's part of our national heritage. So being one of the 6 finalists in the Heritage Award this year, it was like, again, that was about that national recognition that we count, that what we're doing is important. We just need that backed up with proper funding and resources.
And Sara, would you like to comment on the importance or the lack of allies around the trans archive?
I mean, I think both Richard and Orla have kind of touched on every single thing that I would probably say. I'm probably a little bit behind both of them. I've come to this situation that I find myself in a lot later. Everything that I do is out of my own pocket. It's my own time. I buy the boxes myself. I research, all of my research is done through paying it for myself. I store it. It's in this back hall with the door to my left here, except for the larger exhibition pieces, which I'm able to gladly leave store in Tonie office. But, you know, similar to what Orla said earlier about the Gay Project, that could easily change at some point in the future. The space may not be there. So I think I'm at a point now where I've got to start looking at where the archive is going. I need more support. I need more individuals to help me with that work, whether it's voluntary or whether it's paid. It would be brilliant if it was paid for somebody to come in. I'm trying to collate a lot of it and record of it by myself, but that is allied to everything else I do. I have a full-time job. I'm trying to work with Tonie. And therefore you're taking maybe a Saturday here or a Saturday there or a couple of evenings to try and put these things together, as well as trying to research at the same time. So I think it's key that there are allies out there, but I think for me, I'm at the point where allies who can help me grow the archive, get the story out there that it exists. If they have stories, can bring back, I think, you know, my interaction, say, for instance, with Richard over the last year or so, with Northern Ireland has given me a rich history of stuff that's gone on up there and the links between the trans community that are there and here. And similarly with Orla over with Cork, it's been all, and again with Judith Finlay in the National Museum and Kate Renan and all that, and Brian Crowley in Kilmainham Jail. These people have been providing me with information I didn't have through their research. So that also adds to mine. But I think I'm at a pivotal point here where I need to start now looking at how the archive grows. It becomes something more solid, and therefore the next step is some sort of funding. And that is critical, because otherwise it'll end up staying in my back hall with me continually doing a couple of hours a week on it, and that's all it's ever going to be. And that can't happen.
You know, we could have I could share our experiences around the Irish Queer Archive and finding that long struggle to find a permanent place for it, and the trade-offs, you know, that go with that, and the nature of your archive changes. But that's for a whole other evening. We have a few minutes left, and I have a few audience questions that maybe, if you'd be kind enough to consider. So one of them is, how do you try to help students and young people engage with your archives? Who wants to kick off?
I'm
Richard,
happy
maybe.
to.
Orla, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you help young people engage?
And just first, I realised I neglected to mention a couple of key allies. I'll do very quickly. Just the Public Museum in Cork now hosts the physical collection for us, so that's a really important ally and collaboration there. And also, I think we have to recognise the Digital Repository of Ireland as being a really important support for preserving our digital collections, and a real kind of openness there that all of us can use, I think. But in terms of getting young people to engage, and students, I think I got an email from a lecturer in one of the colleges just a couple of weeks ago who told me that his students are reading primarily in online archives at the moment, and that they've been using the Cork LGBT archive, the digital archive, and they found it the most accessible and useful one that they've been using, and they're working exclusively in online archives. And that kind of thing motivates me to keep going with what I'm doing. And I've always tried to, as much as I can, give time to students who are doing kind of research and who are looking for information, and help them to access that. But I think the Cork Queeros exhibition that we just did, I think resonated a lot with a lot of young people. And I think it was because there was such diversity in it. Like it ranged, it wasn't just the usual activists who've been around like for decades. I mean, obviously the Arthur Leahys were there, but it was also the age range went from somebody born in 1945 to somebody born in 1999. People identified in all different kinds of ways, you know, as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, dyke, you know, all kinds of ways. I included pronouns for everybody. I included kind of like how people identify themselves, you know, a number of autistic participants, you know, people who contributed to our community in lots of different ways. So whether it was artists or athletes like Aoife Cook, or, you know, as well as the people who set up those organizations. So I think it is about enabling people to see themselves reflected. And I would hope that everybody who would come in found at least one person in that exhibition that they could relate to, that they could see themselves reflected, you know, evidence that we exist, as Sara was saying earlier. So I think it is about making it accessible, making it interesting, and, you know, sort of having people reflect it in it. One of the things that I'm really conscious of, though, is we talked about gaps earlier, is knowing that there is still a huge gap in terms of bisexual history. And I know that I don't have enough bisexual material in our collection, and I'm actively trying to pursue and rectify. So it is also about always being sure that you have as much inclusive stuff as you can.
Richard, do you want to come in on that? And I'll then go to Sara. And I think we'll have our hour up at that stage. It's just flown. But Richard, if you would come in there. Yeah.
Orla's Cork LGBT Digital Archive is excellent, and it's something that in Northern Ireland, when I was with the LGBT Heritage Project, we adopted that as a model and started a newer, smaller LGBT History NI digital archive. And, you know, that's an obvious source of material. But during COVID, I started with the Linhall Library a monthly online LGBT history club. In fact, one of our guests on that was Sara Phillips on Irish trans history. And those talks and the very interesting Q&A sessions afterwards are still available on the YouTube channel of the Linhall Library. So you can go back over and watch in your own time a very wide range of talks on Irish LGBT history. So there is actually quite a lot of material available there, including material that over the years Sara, Orla, and I have posted to Facebook and Twitter accounts with photographs. So I think it's just initially making students aware that there is actually quite a lot of material for them to get on with. And I know that student interest is increasing. But again, it takes time for people to respond to those queries, and ideally wouldn't be just left up to the individuals to be always doing it in their own time.
Thank you, Richard. And Sara, last words.
Yeah, I think for me, I would agree with, again, Orla and Richard. I think I would love to be able to see a lot of my archive digitally available. I know I've already digitized quite an awful lot of it. In fact, the majority of it. It was something I did very, very early on because I was afraid of losing it because it's sitting here in my house. So I digitized quite a lot, and I've got backups of the digitization just here. So it's probably possible to do that, but I'd need to do it. And I've looked at Orla's as an example. It's really excellent. And for me, about getting access for students, etc., I think I'm also really key about telling those stories. I've been very lucky to get around most of the colleges here in Ireland over the last number of years, pre-COVID, obviously, and I'd love to be able to keep doing that. But I think we need to have the archive available the same way as Orla's put it up, both physically and digitally. And I think it is something that is key for me to go forward so that people can get hold of this information as easy as they can.
So the matter of access. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. I can't believe a whole hour has gone and so quickly. I think we could easily carry on this conversation for hours more. Can I say thank you so much to all of you, to Richard, to Sara, to Orla. Thank you to Breathe for organising it, to Catherine for introducing us earlier. And thanks to everybody who was involved in the organising of the Living with Pride exhibition in the National Library. And even if you can't get to it physically, it is online, and it goes back to, again, what you guys have been talking about, the digital access and the wonder of being able to access something online, no matter where you are. So I'm looking forward to meeting you guys in person for a follow-up chat and perhaps a drink or something, green tea or otherwise. Can I say thank you to everybody globally for listening in this evening, and please join us for our next event next month. Check our website at the National Library, and you can follow up then and look at the exhibition online. So thank you all so much. It was fascinating.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank
Bye
you.
for the moment.